HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Slouching Towards Los Angeles, Living and Writing by Joan Didion's Light, by Steffi Nelson. Read by Exie Sands and Eric Jason Martin. Introduction. In the White Album, Joan Didion famously wrote that a place belongs forever to whoever claims it hardest, remembers it most obsessively, loves it so radically that he remakes it in his image. Criteria that made California hers for all time. Slouching Towards Los Angeles is a celebration and an investigation of Didion's ongoing claim on California and its writers, because she, in turn, belongs to us. This collection began as a literary event I organized in summer 2015 with the arts organization LAND, Los Angeles Nomadic Division, as part of their Manifest Destiny billboard project. A collaboration with the artist Zoe Crosher, this project examined the history of territorial expansion and the promise of the West via billboard art interventions in 10 cities, spanning the I-10 freeway from coast to coast. Santa Monica was the final stop, and the idea was to explore similar themes, taking native daughter Joan Didion, whose California writing encompasses everything from the Donner Party to the Doors, as a touchstone. Based on my own experience of Didion, both her writing and her example, as linked to the visceral pull of Los Angeles, I relocated from New York in 2005, and the conversations I'd had with other writers who also migrated to the City of Angels with their creased copies of Slouching Towards Bethlehem, I began to think that every writer in Los Angeles probably had something to say about Joan Didion. Maybe there was an essay or concept that felt especially resonant, a shared obsession, or it could simply be an image of the author that left an indelible impression and sparked the imagination. I started reaching out to writers I knew and admired, inviting them to take a look at Didion's legacy and influence through the lens of personal experience and against the larger backdrop of the West. With very few exceptions, everyone enthusiastically agreed to participate. Several people told me they had been waiting years to write these particular pieces. The 15 L.A. writers and artists who read their essays for a rapt crowd in a divinely Didion-esque Brentwood backyard has expanded to 25 in this collection, including 2 East Coast inhabitants and 1 Mexico City dweller. Like Didion, most of the contributors, myself included, are or have been, at one time or another, working journalists, writing to deadlines and word counts, striving to discover that subject and angle which make a story greater than the sum of its parts, all while still filing by Monday morning. Some of us have moved on to novels or nonfiction books, screenplays or podcasts. Some of us continue to write for newspapers, magazines, and websites. Some of us teach. What we share is an understanding of a vocation that is often rigid and unforgiving, and a sense of awe and a deep respect for Didion's ability to consistently make it art. We marveled that her gender was at once revolutionary and irrelevant. She wasn't a woman playing a man's game. She created her own game. 20 of this book's 25 contributors are women, a ratio she helped make possible. Joan Didion grew up in Sacramento, went to college in Berkeley, and then, after a stint in New York City, during which she worked at Vogue and met her husband, John Gregory Dunn, she returned to California in 1964 to live for 24 years in Los Angeles. These years were ones of radical change, from the rise of the counterculture through the Reagan era, and in that time, Didion became the city's most important public intellectual, elevating L.A. beyond Hollywood, and Hollywood beyond itself. She held California up like a diamond, revealing each facet and flaw through meticulous and surprising detail, startling psychological insights, and prose so clean it's incandescent. In a 1977 Ms. Magazine interview, Didion described being compelled by subjects that started as pictures in her mind that possessed a certain shimmer around the edges. She compared this effect to the way schizophrenics or those under the influence of psychedelic drugs are said to see the world when the molecular structure starts to break down. Writing is the attempt to understand what's going on in this shimmer, she said. I believe that the shimmer is a crystallization of some truth, her truth, and that Didion's writing transmits these truths to us. Through her words, we enter the shimmer, the place where the molecular structure breaks down and perception is porous, and we emerge with both a new way of seeing and maybe a new way of writing. Slouching Towards Los Angeles is love letter and thank you note, personal memoir and social commentary, cultural history and literary critique. It offers a portrait of a writer and her readers that is as multifaceted as the work that inspired it, and perhaps a little schizophrenic, too. Each author finds a unique entry point. Some meet Didion on the LA freeways or Franklin Avenue. Others are more connected through inner landscapes. Some gaze at a photograph, a fleeting instant captured in Hollywood or Malibu, until it speaks its truth. A few enter through side doors, like Didion's recipe collection and the Sacramento State Archives. Still others share personal histories that take us to Brentwood's Mandeville Canyon and San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury after the hippies. Of course, Joan Didion said goodbye to all that California dreaming in 1988, returning to New York, where she has lived ever since on the Upper East Side. But her last 3 books, The Year of Magical Thinking, Blue Nights, and South and West, all circled back to California, to that formative, fertile time for the writer and her family, now shadowed with tragedy. I recently watched footage of an interview Didion did at the New York Public Library in late 2011 after the release of Blue Nights. At the very end, the interviewer, Sloane Crossley, asked what was bringing her joy, and Didion responded that it was the same things that had always brought her joy. The small things. Then she added, her dry delivery belying the delight darting behind her eyes. Well, sometimes they're really big things, like the sun going down over the Pacific brought me joy last week. And just like that, she is here, staring at the same sun at the edge of the same coast, pondering the same eternity and experiencing the same joy as us. Steffi Nelson, Los Angeles, August 2019. Hello to All This by Anne Friedman. On a Saturday night last year, I found myself in a karaoke bar at 3:45 a.m., participating in a raucous group rendition of New York, New York. This represented a certain amount of personal growth. Not really liking New York had long been part of who I am, even though some of my best friends live there, and it is ostensibly the center of my professional universe. My take has long been, why would I want to make it there when I could make it anywhere else? I spent the worst year of my life in New York, the reality bites phase right after graduation. I moved from Missouri to join my college boyfriend, who had landed my dream job at the New York Times. I found quasi-employment in the form of an internship at a nonprofit, where I wrote press releases and assembled annual reports, carefully selecting stock photos of the most real-looking women and children to accompany bleak statistics about domestic violence. I was not in New York because I had something to prove, nor because I wanted to draw some lines around a blurry fantasy of city life. I was there because I couldn't think of anywhere else to go. New York was someone else's story that I half-heartedly inhabited because I was painfully aware that I hadn't yet written my own. I didn't meet interesting people. I didn't do interesting drugs. I did not walk through Washington Square Park at dawn, or stumble into a cab laughing to get out of the driving rain. I did not take cabs, ever. I was broke, not in a Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe starving artist kind of way, in a staying home and watching DVDs and eating stir-fry kind of way. So I didn't say goodbye to all that. I just said goodbye. In Joan Didion's parting note to the city she loved at 23, originally published as Farewell to the Enchanted City in the Saturday Evening Post, she writes, I do not mean love in any colloquial way. I mean that I was in love with the city, the way you love the first person who ever touches you. And you never love anyone quite that way again. New York and me? We were always meant to be platonic. New York is the prom king. He knows he's great, and he's going to make it really hard on you if you decide you want to love him. I opted out. And from my now comfortable perch on the dry and cracking western edge of this continent, I look back at friends who have stuck things out with New York and think, how? Why? For one thing, they share a willingness to consider New York from a cinematic distance, overlooking the city's many irritants, except insofar as they add grit and drama to their personal story. In day-to-day terms, this manifests as complaining vigorously about subway hardships and bedbug plagues, and then posting Instagram photos of the skyline at sunset. A not insignificant number of the New York lovers I know, especially the 20-somethings, are actually pretty unhappy day-to-day. I picture the prom king's date sitting near him at a party, ignored but still kind of proud to be in the room and on his arm, and incredibly offended at the suggestion that she should break up with him for someone who dotes on her more. Oh, how California dotes. Sun yourself, take the car, let your guard down. Breathe deeply and you'll smell the jasmine and dusty sage. Show up 20 minutes late, just text, sorry, traffic. Explore the weirder corners of your spirituality. Describe yourself without sarcasm as a writer/creative entrepreneur. Work from home. Spread out. Wear the comfortable pants. When I describe this sunshine and avocado-filled existence to some New Yorkers, they acknowledge that they really like California too, but could never move here because they'd get too soft. At first, this confused me. But after hearing it a few times, I've come to believe that a lot of people equate comfort with complacency, calmness with laziness. If you're happy, you're not working hard enough. You've stopped striving. Didion writes, I talk about how difficult it would be for us to afford to live in New York right now, about how much space we need. All I mean is that I was very young in New York, and that at some point the golden rhythm was broken. And I am not that young anymore. I'm not young anymore either. It's impossible for me to know if my California life is so much better than my brief New York tryst, because I've simply grown up and worked my way into a better phase of my career, or whether coming to California was what allowed me to find happiness and success. These things are inextricable. What I do know is that I'm still striving, and I didn't lose a golden rhythm back east. I found it out west. How to Find Your Place in Life, or What I Learned from Joan Didion's On Keeping a Notebook by Jory Finkel. Flaubert once said that a lady is not a lady more than 100 feet from her carriage, and the way that he punished Madame Bovary for her dreams and affairs, stripping her of her money, health, and sanity alike, would seem to illustrate that point. I read that line from Flaubert in college, but Joan Didion was the first writer I read who said something similar in terms that made sense for me personally as a teenage girl who felt like so many teenagers everywhere, painfully displaced in her small, almost suburban, and dreadfully boring Midwestern town. You were just in the wrong place, Didion whispered to me in so many words. She said it in Goodbye to All That, describing the feeling of carrying a container of coffee from chock full of nuts, or the rhythms of putting out a fashion magazine. Remembering when New York felt like the right place for her before she found out it is distinctly possible to stay too long at the fair. And she said it in her essay on Keeping a Notebook, which has an obvious appeal as a how-to primer for any aspiring writer who likes to eavesdrop, but which also delivers an unexpected meditation on identity and place. I was in the right place. Until it was the wrong place, she says of herself. Or, to me, there is nothing wrong with you. You were just in the wrong place. This idea that there is a right place and time for each of us, and you can vacate it by mistake and return to it only at great expense, fills much of her work with a kind of anticipatory nostalgia, looking backward even as she projects into the future. It's an example of what Shakespeare called the preposterous, which, as his scholars love to point out, literally describes a condition where before follows after, or pre follows post, a state of chronological and often psychological confusion. Remember the scene in On Keeping a Notebook when Didion sees a blonde in a Pucci bathing suit at the Beverly Hills Hotel surrounded by fat men? The blonde does the one thing a blonde in a Pucci bathing suit was born to do. She arches one foot and dips it into the pool. There, she's in her element. Right time, right place. It has a cinematic or photographic quality, like Henri Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment. Then, in New York, some years later, when Didion happens to spot the same woman coming out of Saks Fifth Avenue, the magic is gone. She looks tired, and her mink coat is not au courant, not done in the style they were doing that year. In the harsh wind that day, she looked old, and irrevocably tired to me, she writes. Irrevocable is a favorite Didion word. Once you leave it or lose it, you can't get it back. In California, this blonde is beautiful. In New York, she's haggard. Then there's the subject of Didion's first recorded story, which she tells us she wrote at age 5 in a notebook that her mother gave her in hopes she would stop whining and start to write it all down instead. The story features a woman who believed herself to be freezing to death in the Arctic night, only to find when day broke that she had stumbled onto the Sahara Desert, where she would die of the heat before lunch. What is this woman's problem? For one, she doesn't know where she is. Sure, you can read Didion's sensitivity to being displaced as a sign of her own neurotic or depressive tendencies, and she is the first to admit that a well-adjusted person would never need to keep a notebook in the first place. You can also read her attention to displacement as a form of political alienation, reflecting a generational loss of innocence, often associated with the political upheavals of the 1960s, that gives so much of her writing its moodiness. But when I was a teenager in the 1980s in Libertyville, Illinois, population 17,465, and not one of them interested me, I read it differently, as a command to find the right city for me, to find my people. I didn't want to die of heat exhaustion in the cultural desert of my childhood, and I didn't want to be tired and haggard like the Poochie girl in New York. I wanted to be like the Poochie girl in Beverly Hills, perfectly at home in her element. Only bikinis were not what I had in mind. What I dreamed about was Manhattan, as Joan Didion wrote about it, the land of fashion magazines and jasmine soap from Henri Bendel, and drinking until the sun rises and there is no ice left for the drinks. By the time I was a senior at Libertyville High School in Libertyville, Illinois, my family was in free fall financially, and just 2 years away from losing our home to foreclosure. But probably fueled by a growing sense of helplessness, my mom had the idea that we should have one last vacation during my spring break, and she found a cheap hotel in Laguna Beach for a week. For my brother, who was a 13-year-old skate punk just learning to surf, Orange County was heaven. For me, it was closer to hell. We spent too much time in surf and skate shops where my brother wanted to hang out. We spent too much time in beachy boutiques with pink and purple tube tops I would never, ever wear. And we spent too much time on the beach when I would have rather been reading in the hotel. I was reading Anna Karenina at the time, who was arguably punished as violently by Tolstoy as Emma Bovary was by Flaubert, and spent at least 3 days straight lying on the beach reading it. My mother couldn't stomach it. Every time I opened the book, she was visibly irritated. I can understand now that my retreat from the beach activities or from our family banter undermined her expectations of what a spring break family vacation should be. And if the vacation wasn't all fun in the sun, we might remember that our family was struggling to the point where there was little money for college, no savings for anything else, and soon there would be no house to return to from the vacations we couldn't afford. But she never said anything like that. Instead, she kept pronouncing the same warning with a sort of moral authority. If you keep reading that book, your face will not tan evenly. But my mom didn't know. I had read my Didion. I was taking notes, and my mother urging me to put away that book, Anna Karenina, because it was causing an uneven tan, would become the opening scene in my college essay, the one that helped me land a scholarship and get me to New York. New York was, as promised, where I finally felt like I belonged. Until a long decade later, I found myself crying, not in Didion's laundromats, but in the stairwell of my loft in Brooklyn, and in the elevator of the art magazine where I worked in Midtown. And Didion, too, gave me the remedy for the feeling of staying too long at the fair. Los Angeles. Dark Mirror, Reflections on the Golden Dream, by Steffi Nelson. This is a story about love and death in the Golden Land, and begins with the country. Those words, the first sentence of the first essay in Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem, struck me as vividly as the sunshine yellow and day-glow orange cover I found tucked into my mother's bookshelf one summer after college. I was an aspiring magazine journalist with a creative writing degree, but Didion had eluded me until that moment. like so many things that don't appear until we're ready for them. I'd studied Yeats, though, and I recognized the nod to his poem The Second Coming, in which a sphinx-like beast turns its blank and pitiless gaze and slowly moves its thighs. So it was actually the Irish poet, and the acid hues of that 1979 edition, which currently sits on my bookshelf, that led me to the woman whose writing lit up some nerve center in me, speaking to me in a language I'd never heard before, about a California where the sun's gaze was as pitiless as a beast's. Somehow, I didn't read futility in her words. I felt desire and a willingness to risk everything for the prize. Teetering on the edge of adulthood, it was as if I'd been handed a psychic map pointing west. Love, death, the golden land, the country. That opening line of Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream is so simple, yet so loaded with meaning, it's almost a mantra. It reveals nothing, but promises everything, and puts us in the driver's seat, because in a flash, epic crimes and passions and landscapes unfurl like teaser reels across our minds. You might even call it lazy, leaning as it does on the reader's imagination. But that's the territory of the essay, anyway. The chasm between the glittering projection and what pans out. We'd like to believe that the dream will send us directly over the rainbow, reinvented and renewed, with pockets full of shiny nuggets and a suntan, too. But, of course, the odds are against us. In this land, despair is bred at the same rate as hope, and Didion places her bets on the former. In fact, when this essay was originally published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1966, it was titled, How Can I Tell Them There's Nothing Left? On the surface, the tale of a marriage gone sour, an illicit affair, and a murder, Didion frames this exurban tragedy as the golden dream running its inevitable course, and, in so doing, flips the narrative so that the dream is more defined by its end than its beginning. Without the flame-out, in this case Lucille Miller's literal incineration of her husband, Gordon, in the passenger seat of their Volkswagen in San Bernardino, we only know half the story. Of course, she came from somewhere else. We are told about the 35-year-old mother of a teenage daughter, for this is a Southern California story. From the start, it's obvious that nothing good can happen in this place just an hour east of Los Angeles, where the winds blow hot and women cobble their aspirations from movies, newspapers, and the radio. According to her father, Lucille Miller wanted to see the world. In this setup, that was her fatal flaw. What she did get to see was the 1-acre lot through her picture window, and it wasn't enough. Didion visited the California Institution for Women at Frontera, where Miller was incarcerated after being convicted of murder in the first degree, and found it to be populated by murderesses, girls who somehow misunderstood the promise. This was already clear about Miller, she implies, from the high lacquered hairdo she'd worn in the courtroom, as ready for her close-up as Norma Desmond ever was. Didion shows no compassion for Lucille Miller, but I find it hard not to pity this woman, who was self-aware enough to realize that she'd settled for a life that would never fulfill her, and foolish and corrupt enough to think she could change her fate by burning her husband alive, an idea that came to her after watching Double Indemnity. The question is, when and where did the schism happen? Recounting the boilerplate B-movie dialogue exchanged by Miller and her lover, who'd promptly abandoned her once she was accused of murder, Didion asserts the dream was teaching the dreamers how to live. But was it fiction dictating the script? Or was this the glass Didion herself was looking through? She's such a master at manipulating the tension between utopia and dystopia that many LA writers, most of us from somewhere else too, have internalized this queasy balance as our geographic destiny. But I've lived in Los Angeles for more than a decade, and I still don't know if I've been to that pitiless place. I believe I've shielded my eyes against the same slanting sun and heard the Santa Anas rustling through the eucalyptus like snakes. But are those actual memories, or just impressions left by language? And they are like phantom experiences, in which sensations exist without physical cause. The future always looks good in the Golden Land because no one remembers the past, Didion famously claimed in this essay. However, looking at the now iconic portraits of the young writer, I see a woman who is reluctant to smile for the camera, as if happiness or hope were somehow naive, given all that she knows. By any account, she actually was living the dream during this time, but the passionate gratitude her fans have for Joan the person can be explained, I think, by our certainty that she never bought into the myth. She had seen the world and accurately gauged its promise. And then she made her place in the sun anyway, defying her own odds. There she will remain, plain and uncompromising, arms crossed. Nobody's fool. Nobody's victim. The fact that her darkest human dread was borne out decades later makes her youthful vigilance seem that much more exacting. I've often wondered whether Didion, an avowed atheist who has stated her belief in geology over a personal god, knew about Yeats's dedication to mysticism and the occult when she borrowed the title of her collection from him. His language brilliantly lends itself to the explosive creativity and chaos of the late 1960s, like the sages standing in God's holy fire from his second most famous poem, Sailing to Byzantium. But The Second Coming also alludes to a pagan awakening that definitely suits the era, but may not have suited Joan. Still, I'd like to think that somewhere within her solemn heart, maybe in the part of her that walked onto airplanes barefoot and gave her daughter the impossible romantic name of Quintana Roo, she found space for a golden dream to drift in, and a center that would hold. At this precise intersection of time and space, a response to Joan Didion's At the Dam by Margaret Wappler. Since the August afternoon of 2002, when I first drove past the Hoover Dam, the oppressive heat surrounding the structure has never entirely left my skin or my psyche. The killer heat of the West, it almost got me. In a way I wouldn't see for a long time. The West did lay claim to a few things, and the remembrance of those things will slip into a day when I'm not looking, not thinking. Like a pall. Driving up to the dam, the heat socking into the truck, the desert a dun-colored stain in all directions. My life about to rip itself fresh was the first stage of my rebirth into Los Angeles, the West, as an anxious, hopeful creature. On the first day of our cross-country move from Chicago to Los Angeles, everything was a blur, with a few exceptions. The flats of Texas, where we saw lightning jag from its cloudy nest down to the ground. Flagstaff, Arizona, where we stopped for the night and ate shrimp and drank blue margaritas in a carpeted hotel dining room so cold it was almost refrigerated. The next day plunged us into the desert. The insufferable heat was an air trap waiting outside of our U-Haul. We were vibrating across Highway 93 with everything we owned, living and inanimate, inside the truck. Outside, the temperature was 103 degrees. We were running out of gas. There was nothing in the desert. I didn't understand what was happening. Where were all the features? How long could not much of anything go on? Where were the living things? Were we going to break down in this truck with our cat, Lima, who kept slinking from the front to the back and then underneath the brake pad? Would we all go wandering in the desert for help, never to be seen again? Would we look like those cartoons of gaunt, near carcasses crawling through the endless sands, whispering, "Water! Water!" Would we die out here? Would the West be inhospitable to two Midwestern art kids drawn to it by the cracked moonstone mysticism of Fleetwood Mac and P.T. Anderson, who somehow captured the true romantic nature of a 99-cent store at night? "It's gonna be okay," Adam said when I panicked about making it to the next gas station. A sign had flashed at some point saying, "Gas station a million miles away," and we had flagrantly ignored it. The empty tank sign had been on for several miles. We were on a detour from the reliable straights of Interstate 40, rattling toward the Hoover Dam, the gateway from the Wild West to what was west of that, the end of the continent. Neither of us had ever laid eyes on the dam. Really, Adam wanted to see it, and I wanted to make him happy in this small way. But as we drew closer to it, everything felt worse. I was still swallowing tears from saying goodbye to Lizzie, my almost sister, and Chris, a guy I accidentally fell in love with. Goodbye to Chicago. Goodbye to our house with the checkered floor. Goodbye to the nights I had spent riding my bike to a dive bar with Chris after work. Him looking back at me and kicking.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?